Would you go up in a plane knowing you had a 50-50 chance of not landing safely and a 1 in 3 chance of dying? Of course not. No sane person would do that. Well, at one time, that is exactly what many young men did, and this was during World War II. The United States Army Air Force in Europe had a casualty rate of 115,332 men, with over 26,000 men dead. Almost half of those casualties were in the European Theater of Operation, the ETO for short. If you're a baby boomer, chances are you grew up in a neighborhood that was full of veterans from the Second World War. Stand in your backyard and just toss a rock in any direction and it would land in a veteran's yard. Now, my neighborhood was no exception. The gentleman who lived right behind me, Mr. Paul Golden, was one of those vets. He was just a young man among a generation of young men who answered the call when the country asked. So why am I telling this story? Well, a long time ago when I was a child, Mr. Golden brought home a film that he wanted to watch. This was long before blockbusters became famous. We're still talking about the old movie reels. Okay, the film was about the Ploesti raid on August 1st, 1943. He said his friend was shown in that film as a POW. I was lucky enough to be invited over to watch the film with his son Timmy. Anyways, this is when I found out that Mr. Golden had been in a combat crew flying over Europe. Later, long after his death, his wife Joni told the story about when Paul had to bail out of his stricken bomber. Basically, she said he got hung up in the trees and was so scared he waited until dark before he got out of the trees. Hey, me personally, I would have stayed up in that tree until the war was over. Now, I knew there was more to the story, and years later I did some digging and found out what actually happened. Paul was in the 461st Bomb Group, 767th Bomb Squadron, based out of Torretta, Italy, as part of the 15th Air Force. His squadron flew B-24s. His plane was an H model, so this plane was equipped with a nose turret. On May 27, 1944, Paul's squadron, along with the rest of the 461st Bomb Group, went on mission number 33 to Salon De Provence Airdrome in France. The airfield supported the Ju-88 aircraft, which was raiding shipping in the Mediterranean. Now, Paul's plane was named Flack Finder. The 10 men flying that day were pilot, Second Lieutenant Gerald Maroney, co-pilot, First Lieutenant Winston Lawrence, bombardier, Second Lieutenant Warren R. Mudge, navigator, First Lieutenant Paul A. Golden, engineer, Master Sergeant Harold C. Steele, radio operator, Donald E. Ellis, nose gunner, Sergeant Benjamin H. Norrid, ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Owen B. Streeper, right waist gunner, Sergeant Leon Zinner, tail gunner, Sergeant Alvin L. Rains. Taking up from Torrella Air Base in southern Italy, the bomber formation headed westward, flying over Cape Cicero, out over the Tyrrhenian Sea, crossing over Cape Corsica, then crossing the French coast at Cape d'Antibes. At this point, the bomber formation turned west to approach the target, the airbase at Salon De Provence. It was over Cape d'Antibes that the flak guns opened up on the formation. Paul's B-24 was hit. It was 10:30 in the morning. The right wing was on fire, the starboard engines were out. Pilot, Second Lieutenant Maroney, peeled away from the formation and ordered the bomb load to be salvoed immediately. Now, hoping to make it to Switzerland and interment, Maroney asked his navigator, Paul Golden, for a course to Switzerland. Now, heading up the Seiana Valley, it was becoming obvious to Maroney and his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Lawrence, that there was no way they could make it into neutral Switzerland. By the time the plane had passed over the town of Grasse, Maroney made the decision to bail out. Making a wide left turn, Maroney gave the order for the crew to get out. Now, Paul's plane was the only one lost on mission number 33 that day. There were 3 witnesses to the event. The Casualty questionnaire answered by Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Sullivan in Crew 68 stated, Lieutenant Maroney's plane was flying on our right wing just as we went over the coast of France. Flak came up, and it seemed as soon as the flak started, Lieutenant Maroney's plane got hit. The plane peeled out of formation and continued right along the coast. The plane seemed under control. It is my opinion that they would try to make it to the Isle of Corsica. Now, Technical Sergeant Michael Myers in Crew 71 stated, while flying in number 2 position, Flight B, we had a good view of Lieutenant Maroney's ship, which was flying in number 7 position of the same flight. Arriving over the coast of France, well before reaching our target, we ran into considerable flak. Lieutenant Maroney's number 3 engine got hit by flak, and I believe the nose turret. Also, the bombs were salvoed as he peeled off from the formation and continued flying along the coast. The plane seemed to be under control and then passed out of sight. No parachutes were seen. Staff Sergeant Denzel Lecliffe, also from Crew 71, gave basically the same report as Technical Sergeant Myers, except he added that Maroney's plane was heading in the general direction of Corsica. Now, in his casualty questionnaire given after his return to Naples, Maroney stated, on taking a burst of anti-aircraft fire just under the right wing, I immediately left formation because the 2 right engines were shot out and I couldn't feather either one of them. I jettisoned the bombs immediately. I headed for Switzerland, but soon abandoned the plan as we were losing altitude fast and the mountains were very high. Then fire broke out under the right wing, and one report from the waist informed me that the flames almost reached the tail. The drag of the unfeathered propellers was causing the plane to lose 700 feet of altitude per minute. The elevation in that area of the Maritime Alps was around 12,000 feet. Maroney's only choice was to have his crew bail out. They were only 2,000 feet above the ground. Now, the Germans were already alerted to the crippled plane and were converging from all directions to the potential crash site. Sounding the bailout bell, Lieutenant Golden, Lieutenant Mudge, and Staff Sergeant Benjamin Nora jumped through the nose wheel. The gunners, Sergeant Zinner, Ellis Rains, Streeper went out the waist window. Co-pilot Lieutenant Lawrence and Technical Sergeant Steele followed the gunners out the waist window. Now, Maroney, last man out, exited his stricken plane through the nose hatch just 400 feet above the ground. All 10 men made it safely to the ground, but they were in the middle of the forest, scattered over a wide area of the 2 slopes of the Charon mountain. This would account for just 4 men from the crew being captured. Bombardier Lieutenant Mudge was captured near Peron around 2 p.m. that day. Sergeant Rains was on the run until 11 p.m. when he was caught by the French police near Sipieres. Now, Sergeant Zinner, with a broken leg, managed to evade capture until June 1st. Sergeant Nord had hooked up with the local Marquis. However, he was captured on July 30th near Puget Therin. I'm going to tell more on Nord's capture a little bit later in the video. Now, as for Lieutenant Maroney, Lieutenant Lawrence, Lieutenant Golden, Sergeant Steele, Ellis, and Streeper, they were able to evade capture. Now, once on the ground, the 6 evaders needed to find a safe place to hide out until they could figure out a way out of France and into Spain. Lieutenant Maroney landed 25 yards from his plane crash at the summit of Eagle Peak, which was located between Lamas and Thorenc. Now, the website uswarmemorials.org tells the story of what happened to the evading flyers. Lieutenant Gerald J. Maroney landed in the Garonne Valley near the hamlet of Sousse. He was taken in and hidden by the local residents. Lieutenant Golden and Sergeant Streeper landed in the forest in the Garonne Valley. Now, the valley and the forest were being searched by the Germans. The 2 men buried their chutes. Now, it's at this point that Lieutenant Golden would have burnt any navigational information he had on him. Now, Golden and Streeper spent the night dodging German patrols, trying to get to Lamas. Luckily for them, the next day they were helped by local residents who took them to the Parmelin family. The left waist gunner and radio operator, Sergeant Donald Ellis, who also landed on the same side of the Charon mountain, was alone. Now, Sergeant Ellis worked his way down to the village of Lamas. On the outskirts of the village, he waited, not knowing if it was safe to enter. It wasn't until Saturday, March 30th, that Ellis decided to take a chance and enter the village and ask for help. Ellis told the inhabitants that he was an American flyer. Once again, Eduardo Parmelin stepped up and took Ellis to another safe house. Edward Parmelin did not have enough food to feed Golden, Streeper, Ellis. He had his own family of a wife and 2 children, plus 2 Jewish refugees, along with 2 of his friends hiding from the French STO. That was the Vichy French labor conscription unit that sent people to Germany to do forced labor. With food being scarce, something had to be done. It was the parish priest of Gréolières, Father Vale, who helped organize the villages of Aiglun, Gréolières, Las Mas, Saint-Auban and Thorenc to come together and supply the food and clothing the Americans would need. The people in those villages risked their lives hiding these down American flyers in their homes and keeping them supplied with food and clothing. Now the website aerorelic.org has a picture of the men while in hiding. This picture is taken at some point during the time in suit. On the left is Gerald Maroney, in the white hat is Paul Golden, on his left is Owen Streeper, and in front is Donald Ellis. Now this photo was taken by Edward Parmelin. Now the reason why Sergeant Norwood was not captured until July 30th was because he was actually working with the French resistance in that area. Sergeant Steele was also working with the resistance during this time period. He stated in his casualty questionnaire, the last time he saw Sergeant Norwood was at 4 a.m. on July 30th near Ushot. He was later captured by the Germans in a skirmish between the FFI, that's the Free French Forces of the Interior, and enemy forces. Lieutenant Lawrence, the co-pilot, working with the British agent and the resistance, was the only one who had knowledge of the movement of the entire crew, except for Sergeant Steele. Now the men were hidden from the Germans from May 27th until August 21st, 1944. Now at that time, the British agent, whose name is not known, helped Lawrence gather up Maroney, Golden, Ellis, Streeper, and Steele, and proceeded to head to the Allied lines at Saint-Tropez. On August 22, 1944, Maroney, Lawrence, Golden, Ellis, Streeper, and Steele were flown to Naples, Italy. By late September of 44, these men were back in the States. For the men who became POW, their reparation would not happen until Germany surrendered, which was on May 8, 1945. Lieutenant Mudge, Sergeant Rayner, Norwood, Zinner would endure almost a year of captivity until the Nazi regime surrendered. They most likely had to endure the Nazi version of the Death March in 1945. See, the Nazis moved all POWs west to Moosburg POW camp so that the Soviets could not liberate them. The Nazis wanted to use the POWs as bargaining chips with the Western Allies. The people of that region felt so strongly about the men who parachuted from Flack Finder that the town of Thorenc built a memorial to commemorate the crash of the B-24 bomber Flack Finder and the 10 men who parachuted into their villages. There are also some relics of the crash still up on the mountain. You know, it's kind of funny, growing up in my small neighborhood, our fathers never talked about what they did during World War II. There were times among themselves they would talk, or you might overhear a snippet about the war at a neighborhood cookout, or see a framed photograph and ask when that was taken. The usual response, oh, that was taken during the war, and that was it. Now, I know for a fact that in my neighborhood, Mr. Randall was a fighter pilot flying P-47s. I don't know if he got overseas. Mr. Fox was in the Navy. As a matter of fact, he served prior to the war. He got out about 6 months before, I believe he told me, and then Pearl Harbor happened and he went right back into the Navy. Mr. Shigori, he served in the U.S. Army. Now, Mr. Grasso served in the U.S. Army and was wounded in the Battle of the Bulge, and I think he was shot in the head. Now, Mr. McAuliffe, he served in the U.S. Navy. Now, I used to cut his lawn as a kid in the 70s, you know, before I could have a real job. Now, in his cellar, where he kept the mower, was a small frame picture. I believe it said the USS Indianapolis. Now, I don't know if he was on the ship when it went down. We didn't realize that these young men had given up their childhood to the Great Depression and then given up their young adulthood to fighting and end fascism. To the kids in my neighborhood, and I'm sure this is true for all baby boomers, these were just our fathers. We had no idea what they went through during the war. They were just Mr. Golden, Mr. Shigori, Mr. Fox, Mr. Grasso, Mr. McAuliffe, Mr. Randall. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, ring the bell for notifications, give a thumbs up, but most importantly, sign in and leave a comment below, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching.